cutting apart a muslin that was fitted, and I take in consideration all of the markings that I made during the fitting in order to create the pattern that I'm going to lay down onto the cloth and begin cutting. I'm just taking apart the muslin so that I can make an exact replica with the alterations that came out of the fitting. This is the muslin for the panty, which is the base, the brief that forms the base of the tutu skirt. I'm pinning it in half to hold the layers together. Now I'm going to use a contrasting marker, a blue marker, to make a comparison mark between the left half and the right half, because I can see through this and I can see that my upper edge is symmetrical and my lower edge is pretty symmetrical also, so there aren't very many adjustments that I need to make from left to right. So my blue marker will be the marker then that I follow when I'm actually cutting the pattern out. I'm making a little fold here because this marker line showed that I needed to have a little bit different tilt. So I'm going to just fold that back, and then that will be taken into consideration when I lay the pattern on the fold. Now, I also need to measure 1 inch up from the upper edge, because the line that I have marked is where the uppermost layer of the tutu skirting will be attached, and also the point at which the bodice will be attached to the tutu skirt. So in order to make it a little easier to work with, we give ourselves a lip of about 1 inch. This is the power net. It's a firm but stretchy fabric, and this is the base that will serve as the base of the tutu skirt, to which all of the layers, many layers of tulle will be sewn on, and it's got some stretch, some firm stretch, in order to adhere to the dancer's body and move as the body moves. Now we want the stretch to go around the dancer, not up and down. And although this stretches both directions, it stretches less going across than it does on the lengthwise grain. So as we fold this, we will place the brief pattern on the crosswise fold. And we readjust as needed to conserve as much fabric as possible. Try to lay it out to make sure that the grain of the fabric is laying nice and flat in order to stay true to the shape. I cut with a rotary blade. Many people are not comfortable with it, but with a little practice it sure makes work a lot quicker. It makes the edges a lot neater. I'm cutting right along my markings to allow for the 1 inch lip at the top of the brief. And I'm following the original cut edge of the pattern that I used to fit the dancer. Now around the leg, I'm going to allow about 1/4 of an inch of allowance, and I'm just going to eyeball it 1/4 of an inch beyond the blue marker line. Now I'm going to make a little bit of a mark. I'm going to use a marker and just lightly mark the edges here. This is where I had notated that the elastic needs to be pulled to tighten this part in. That way it will give me a guide for adjusting the elastic when I install it for this dancer. I'm going to put the name directly on here. This is Ali LeBay. I usually put it right on the edge of the back seam allowance, because this will never be cut off and it won't get lost. Next, I'll be working on cutting the base muslin layers out of the bodice. Freshly washed and pressed cotton muslin. This forms the flat lining of the tutu bodice. Whatever over fabric has been chosen is usually more of a fashion fabric with a nicer finish, and this gets flat lined, sewn directly to that piece of fabric for each portion of the bodice to keep the fashion fabric stable and to preserve the wearing of it and to sort of provide another layer for opacity of the garment. The side front is cut on the bias. That means the diagonal grain of the fabric. The fabric has a warp and a weft, and when you cut a piece of a pattern on the diagonal, it allows it to have some stretch. This is the side front of the body, so this allows for the bodice to hug very closely the curves of the dancer and also be able to move with the dancer, and yet it doesn't leave a lot of wrinkles or gapes. So we always cut the side front on the diagonal, the bias cut of the fabric. I'm turning this over because I have some notes over here as to additions that need to be made lengthwise, and I'm just going to continue laying my pieces out because I want to have the best use of my fabric again. We have some balancing to do from the right side to the left side. When I marked her waistline, it was a little higher on this side than on this side. This dancer did not have any notable changes in her body, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take the difference between these two marks. That's called truing up your pattern. We did need to add a 1/4 inch of room on this seam, so I'm simply going to draw a new seam in. And again, this lower edge, there's a difference between the two, so I'm going to draw the line that takes the difference between the middle. I have a note here to add a 1/4 inch of room in this area of the hip, so here I'm just going to use my chalk to go beyond that line because I can use a marker on the pattern, but I don't want to use a marker on the actual flat lining. This is the center back. We allow enough extra room to be able to fold in a cover and a facing for the hook and eye tape once it's installed. I'm ready to start cutting as soon as I make a few marks for my seam allowance. I like to allow a 1/2 inch seam allowance at the top edge and a 1/2 inch seam allowance at the bottom edge. So again, I'm using my blue line and marking my 1/2 inch seam allowance. Now, on the vertical seams that go in the bodice, I add 3/4 of an inch. It just gives us a little more wiggle room for fitting purposes. If pieces have to be adjusted, it's a little easier to adjust if you have some room to work with. Remember, the first chalk mark I made was the adjustment for where it should be finished. Now this chalk mark marks my seam allowance. Finally, my last piece, the center back. Again, I'm ready to cut. I'm going to go ahead and put a couple of weights here so that this doesn't move around. Now, in line with the waistline that is marked, I put a little notch in the fabric. That helps us keep everything lined up properly when we're assembling the bodice. We always put the marking for what that is. That's a center back panel. It always goes at the top of the panel so that, again, if the pattern piece is to get separated, we'll know what it is and how it should go together.